On today's World Insight, Japan and South Korea hit with fresh 25% U.S. tariffs starting August 1, while Trump announced new import tax rates on a dozen other nations. Serious trade talks do grind on with China, the European Union, and India. So what's the trade outlook amid tariff-driven uncertainties? U.S. President Trump announced on Monday a 25% tax on imports from Japan and South Korea, along with new tariff rates on a dozen other nations that would take effect on August 1. In letters on Truth Social addressed to leaders of the various countries, Trump warned them against raising their own import taxes or the U.S. would again hike tariffs. Trump has yet to work out differences on trade with the European Union and India, among other trading partners, while serious talks with China are ongoing in which imports from that nation are being taxed at 55%. U.S. tariffs on Japanese imports would have an impact on the country, warned Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on Tuesday, though he did say negotiations would go on. For its part, South Korea's trade ministry said early Tuesday that it seeks to speed up talks with the U.S. to come up with a mutually beneficial deal before the 25% tax on its exports goes into effect. So, what's the trade outlook amid tariff war uncertainty? The best way forward. Time to loop in our panelists.
Joining us, Yan Liang, Creamer Chair, Professor of Economics from Willamette University. Also, Saurabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we do not know necessarily exact content of whether it is an agreement or it is a consensus reached by China and the United States, but we do see warming up of talks at least. So Yan, tell me more. What do you see as the nature now of the discussion between the two sides, and what does that mean for themselves, the rest of the world?
More to be done. More needs to happen between the two sides to have the trade negotiations to eventually, normalize trade other than using, trade as a weapon to achieve other geopolitical or other non-economic objectives. And that's very consequential because both sides are the largest trading partners in the world. And when both sides have these trade disputes, it also affects many, many other countries as well.
Right. Now, to you, Mr. Gupta, 90 days, quote unquote, set by the United States. Of course, it can violate itself at any time it wants. These days, the words coming from Washington is not just necessarily that taken seriously by everybody else. But having said that, the timing is interesting. What does it say now as to both sides? How are they looking at these 90 days? And what do they think is the real nature of the trade discussion?
Now, with regard to the 90 days, I distinguish that there are two 90 days happening out here. The 90 days with regard to U.S.-China negotiations falls sometime in August. I think it's August 12th. So US and China are not facing an immediate deadline, which will anyways get postponed or pushed further behind. Many of the other countries, which were also hit with the reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs on April 2nd, and then which was suspended on April 7th or 8th, they are facing those 90-day. Of course, most of those will get pushed also further beyond. These are kind of for the U.S. administration an action forcing mechanism to get those concessions that it wants, but it's realizing it is just getting handful of concessions, and that too from mostly minnows. The main negotiating partners, the EU and Japan, are taking a hard line, and understandably so. They've already given enough, and they don't need to be blackmailed this way. So there are many moving parts out here, and that's where the situation stands.
How is this moving parts of others likely also to have an impact on the nature and the extent of discussions between China and the United States when it comes to trade? Mr. Gupta.
That's an important point because as we've seen in the two agreements which have already gotten done, one is a presumptively has got done with Vietnam, There are third country provisions out here, and those third country provisions are especially anti-China provisions. So that process is playing itself. It will willy-nilly impact the nature of trade of these third countries, Vietnam and the UK, with China. It is not exactly clear how extensive that impact will be. Think about Vietnam. It is in regional value chains, and it depends on Chinese intermediate goods inputs. It just can't walk out of that regional value chain. Its whole value proposition, Vietnam's value proposition, is based on being in those regional value chains. So we'll have to see if there's a pattern and how that pattern plays itself out. But there's no doubt the US in industrially salient sectors wants to decouple not just itself from China, but also supply chains that run through third countries with China. But remember, China is the world champion in intermediate goods, and so it's not that easy to separate China from these value chains.
Yeah, and what do you think about that? How are negotiations that the United States is having with others likely to have an impact on that, on China and the United States when it comes to nature and extent, and vice versa, of course?
China basically says that the U.S. Trade agreements with other countries should not affect or negatively harm China's own interest. And I think that has a very important point. As I think sort of talked about, China is the largest trading partner with Vietnam, is the largest export destination outside of the region, ASEAN region. It is the largest import partner, accounting for 30% of Vietnam's imports. And so Vietnam really relies on China's supply chain to be able to manufacture, for their own domestic consumption and also exports. So this really undermines Vietnam's own interest, as well as China's interest, as well as the regional interest. So I think this is still a very thorny issue that needs to be worked out.
Right. On the other hand, we have seen the big buildable bill, so-called, of the United States has been passed at both floors in the Senate and also at the House. It has clauses in which will have an impact on China's trade with the United States. Yan, your thoughts on that?
Right. So I think what is included in this bills are various, tax incentives to bring, manufacturing or other investments back to the United States. It also has clauses where, the expenses can be tax exempt or reducted when it comes to expenses on investment and R&D and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think it is true that, all these measures are to promote the U.S. interest, actually U.S. first, American first interest. Not to mention, the idea is that, by levying tariffs, the U.S. is able to pay for partly all these tax cuts because that would be very expensive and at over $3 trillion to the U.S. debt. So the sort of the thoughts now is to be able to impose more tariffs on imports, and that is actually happening. The U.S.'s tariff has gone up by 109% year on year as of June this year. Yeah. So it is clear that these tariffs are actually paid by the U.S. consumers and U.S. businesses, and yet this was seen as a way to pay for the expensive tax cuts that mostly would benefit the rich.
Mr. Gupta, your thoughts on the same question?
He wants to have these. There are those things called digital taxes, digital services taxes, which is predominantly focused not so much on China as much as it is on the EU and on the United Kingdom. And while some of the provisions of the BBB were pulled back, there are other obscure provisions in the income tax code which would allow him to utilize that and still impose those penalties on those countries. And he has that in his America First investment policy executive order. So these are coming to hit these other countries. So the bottom line out here is he wants to just reshore, and he's going to do it against whoever. And of course, China is caught up in this because it has the biggest trade. But that's how it's playing out.
Yeah, at this moment, though, we do see some positive signs from both sides. For example, design software, Ethan, and also aircraft engines. These are items earlier being banned from exporting to China, and these days the U.S. Department of Commerce have notified certain Chinese companies about the resumption of these exports. Of course, it takes time to implement it, and there are also issues within the process as to how it can be implemented smoothly. Meanwhile, we also see rare earth exports to the United States now has been resumed. So how do you see both sides leverages toward one another? And how much will this trade relationship be shaped by leverages for the near future? Ms. Liang.
Both sides are using this leverage, to be able to resume some kinds of normal trade relationship. But of course, China has different objectives. China always upholds the multilateral trading system and does not see trade as a zero-sum game. Whereas in the United States at this point, I think they are seeing trade as a zero-sum game and really trying to so-called, defeat China. And also trying to reshore manufacturing jobs into the United States. But of course, as I think Saurabh talked about, there are many policy missteps. They're basically undermining the U.S.'s own, strategic interests in various, various industries, like the green industry. Now, I think going forward, China will continue, I think, to have certain controls over rare earth minerals because that is a national security, that is a strategic interest on part of China. On the other hand, I think the U.S. will continue to weaponize the tech industries and will try to continue to have the tech ban, right, on export of high-end chips and other, AI-related technologies to China. So what I'm seeing is both sides will continue to try to de-risk. But I think, China has certain advantages in here because China's AI industries and the entire ecosystem has been developing very quickly. Whereas the United States, I think for them to wean off the dependence on the rare earths will be much harder, given the political barriers, technological constraints, and other legislative, barriers to really revitalize their own rare earth minerals industries. Not to mention, they don't really want to work with allies, and that would make it even more difficult for the United States to build a reliable, supply chain in the rare earth magnets industry.
Now, Mr. Gupta, how much do you think leverages these days has become the nature of the trade relations? Are we going to see this as the future trend in at least the near future? What does that mean for all of us?
I think an immense source of leverage for the Chinese side is that Mr. Trump, at the end of the day, really doesn't care as much about on export controls and these other extraneous topics and tech competition. For him, it is about the trade deficit, and it's about huge amount of exports to China. China is seen as this country with this capacity to absorb huge American exports. That's what he wants. Yeah. If the United States, if China can go some way to satisfying that, that becomes a potent source of leverage on Mr. Trump, because that can be yanked back if Americans come with export controls. So it's devolved to this game of leverage, but at this point of time, the two sides are maintaining an uneasy ceasefire in the course of this process.
Ms. Liang, final points.
Well, I think, again, we need to go back to the multilateral trading system. BRICS has just made a declaration, and it's very clear that the Global South wants to go back to the more multilateral-based system instead of this kind of unilateralism, protection-based, and also playing with leverage as if it's, the rules of the jungle. But at the same time, I think, the world is going to go on. Trading system is going to be changed and reshaped, whether or not the U.S. is on board or not. So look forward to seeing, the improvements of the global trading system.
Well, thank you so much for both of you for joining us on this discussion. Really appreciate it. We're going to see more development definitely for the days and weeks ahead. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. As the world's two largest economies, the trajectory of the U.S. and China relations holds pivotal significance for global stability and prosperity. I sat down with Wu Xinbo, director at the Center for American Studies of Fudan University. Professor Wu reflects on the relationship between the two countries on many fields and also look at the potential of important meetings ahead. Let's listen in. Professor Wu, tell me more about the latest trade discussions between the two sides. According to public information, whether this is a success or not from China's perspective?
From trade war to trade negotiation, there is a big difference. I mean, early in the Trump administration, basically the U.S. approach to China was coercion and blackmail by imposing tariff. So that is something like, U.S. win, China will lose. But now we sit down at Geneva first and then in London to talk about trade issues. And for any negotiation to be successful, you need give and take. You need a trade-off. So from coercion to transaction, it's a big difference. It's a big difference. Even though in any trade talks, one side may gain more, the other side may gain less, but still just, based on more reasonable bargaining process. So I think we are on the right track.
All right. From your answer, Professor, if I could borrow two words, transactional and coercion, which is China looking at when it comes to nature of U.S.-China relations as a result of the ongoing discussions on trade? And will they shape the nature of this relationship or not?
I think it has a big impact on the overall relations between our two countries. If the U.S. approach sticks to coercion, I wouldn't see any progress on trade and economic issues. And more broadly, the entire relationship would be, in a stalemate situation. But now, as we gradually make progress on trade and economic issues, and both sides are gaining fruits from this process, and as such, we are building more momentum for moving down the road. And also in this process, we're actually building the mutual trust because both sides will feel that, okay, that is the right way we can do business with each other. So if we continue on the current path, not only will we make more progress on the trade and economic issues, but that will also generate more positive momentum for this entire relationship.
When it comes to China-U.S. relations, we know it's not as simple as just the trade relations, but rather in many other fields, for example, security, diplomacy. And earlier, we saw the two sides having platforms for trade and economic issues, platforms for strategic and diplomatic political issues, and the list goes on. And now we see that trade front is very active. What about the other fronts?
Well, you raise a good point. I mean, so far, this relationship has been based on a single pillar, that's trade and economic relations. But that's not enough. And for China-U.S. relations, we need as many pillars as possible. For example, we need the national security teams from both sides to reconnect with each other. They should talk to each other and discuss issues of mutual interest. And also we need to promote people-to-people exchanges, to encourage two societies to engage with each other. So if we can move from trade economics to security, to diplomacy, to cultural and educational exchanges, that will produce more concrete benefits for both sides. At the same time, it will also gradually improve the atmosphere for the entire relationship. So that's something we need to do in the next 1 month or two.
We see China is pretty enthusiastic about what you just said, these approaches. But is that also what Washington consider as their core interest and therefore likely to go down that path as well together with China?
I doubt it. I mean, for some people in the Trump administration, they just don't want to engage China. They don't want to talk to their Chinese counterparts. So that is why already 6 months into Trump's second administration, there was no meeting between two national security teams. That is unprecedented. So if we, begin to think about the summit in the fall, we need to bring two national security teams to meet each other as soon as possible. And then in that case, I think President Trump, he has to intervene and give order to his people that this is what I want to do. You guys need to do it.
Right, here comes the interesting point. Since you talk about the summit, there were earlier media reports about this possibility or that possibility without quoting all of them. Let me ask you, Professor Wu, what is likely to be now, given the nature of U.S.-China relations evolving, maybe that's a diplomatic way of putting it, how do you see these heads of state meetings likely to set the tone and the nature of this relationship?
I think this summit is very important in terms of, the two heads of states, they meet, they will set the course in the right direction and which direction they want this relationship to move on. And secondly, when they meet, they are also going to discuss the most difficult issues in bilateral relations. Issues that cannot be resolved at the working level. And only two leaders have the political determination to solve the problems. And especially given the positive personal relations between two leaders, I think when the summit happens, that will certainly generate something positive for relations between our two countries.
Well, once again, that is a very good wish to the nature of this relationship, at least at the very top heads of state level. But we have seen since the Obama administration, Professor Wu, there has been a switch of priority for the U.S. administrations. For example, less on Europe, more on Asia, particularly with China in mind, whether it is as a competitor or as a rival. Of course, different administrations have different circumstances to implement that, and the result is different. But now it seems that with the Trump administration 6 months into the government, ever clearer sign of America first, but also a clearer sign of having its focus on Asia, particularly on China, as a potential rival. How do you see that is going to change at all when it comes to strategic goals of this relationship, and when it comes to tactical and rhetorical goals for the current stage?
Let's be honest. I mean, President Trump, he is not a strategic guy. He is more a pragmatic person. So when he thinks about relations with China, he wouldn't necessarily, borrow the framework of strategic competitor or things like that. He would think about whether, I can make a deal with China. So I think the current situation.
But the deal has always been changing.
Always changing depending on the process.
Indeed.
But basically, I think, after the first round of trade war between our two countries, I hope he came to understand that China is, after all, the single most important business partner to the U.S. because the U.S. simply cannot afford, to decouple from the Chinese economy. U.S. relies too much on the supply chain from China. So in that sense, he may want to have a more realistic, pragmatic approach to this relationship. To be sure, there are still people in his team who would talk about strategic competition, would continue to define as China as America's primary rivalry or even enemy. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's up to Trump to make the final decision. So from his recent phone call with President Xi, and also from his forceful intervention in bilateral trade and economic talks, I think he's trying to exercise a leadership in U.S.-China policy under his second administration, making sure what we call the super hawkish people will not take this relationship in the wrong direction. So that's what we hope from him.
At the recently concluded World Peace Forum in Beijing, you had a comprehensive discussion in front of an audience of few hundred with a bunch of American scholars as well, in which you talk about some of the easier, quote unquote, measures that can be implemented to create better ambience and also interactions between the two sides. For example, student visa, especially America toward the Chinese students visa, and also the establishment or re-establishment of consulates in each other's countries. Now, how viable do you think those measures can be done, and should that be with top leadership meeting, or should that be done before the meeting to pave for the way?
I think some can be done before the summit, and some may need two leaders to make a decision when they meet. For the visa issue, I mean, certainly the U.S. has already made some adjustments. I mean, they keep changing the policy, right, from time to time. But the latest information I got is that, okay, they began to issue visa to Chinese students who are going to study in the U.S. In the fall semester. That's good. They should also improve the visa policy for Chinese scholars who are going to travel to the United States. So this doesn't have to wait for the two leaders to meet and make a decision. But for the two closed consulates to be reopened, it may take two leaders to make a decision when they meet.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insider or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.